what would it have been like to fight in the Civil War, the bloodiest wars in the history of the United States? How did soldiers cope when faced with new weapons of war, such as rifle muskets that could wipe out dozens of men at a time? And just how did these soldiers live day to day? Join us in this video as we discuss what it was like to be a soldier during the Civil War. Before we begin, if you're interested in early access to videos and live chats with the creator of Intrigued Mind, consider subscribing to our Patreon. Your support will greatly help us keep the channel producing more intriguing content. The bloodiest war in the history of the United States would commence in the second half of the 19th century, following decades of simmering tensions between the northern and southern states over the idea of slavery. Southerners believed slavery should be expanded into new territories to ensure it didn't die out. On the other hand, the northern colonies had already begun abolishing a practice they deemed inhumane. Just a year prior to the beginning of the Civil War, the newly formed Republican Party, which was opposed to the spread of slavery, had four major candidates running for president. Abraham Lincoln was one such candidate and would go on to win the electoral vote. The election of a president from a party that opposed slavery jolted white Southerners into action. Less than 2 months after Lincoln won, South Carolina delegates, meeting in Charleston, decided to secede from the Union, that is, to formally withdraw membership in the United States. At 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, Confederate troops attacked Union forces stationed in South Carolina at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Just 34 hours later, the Union forces surrendered. Historians generally agree this event was the beginning of the American Civil War. The brutal war lasted for over 4 years. At best estimates, approximately 620,000 soldiers lost their lives. According to historians, the casualties of the Civil War are equal to the total American fatalities in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, and the Korean War combined. This statistic bears witness to the tragic number of lives lost in this devastating conflict. Around 3 million Americans signed up to serve in the Civil War. Each individual represents a unique story, and it can be said that no two men had the same journey into war, nor would they have similar experiences in battle or an equal emotional response to the devastation they would soon witness. When it comes down to how men experienced life during the Civil War, we must first consider where the men came from. What can motivate a factory worker to leave his comfortable position and join men in the trenches that dotted the nation? Why did the former innkeeper lay down his keys and opt for a rifle? And what could possibly motivate the local farmer to leave his land and charge headfirst across the plain as bullets whizzed by his head? When the war officially began, the United States was still a relatively young country. Evolving ideas of democracy in both the northern and the southern states pushed them into positions that they thought best to protect their own interest. When discussing what could have motivated a soldier to serve, the ideas aren't as black and white as one may think, and they certainly didn't always stem from the voices of Abraham Lincoln or Jefferson Davis. Not every northerner was an abolitionist, nor was every southerner a slave owner. However, what we know for sure is that over 3 million men signed up to fight for their respective sides in what would become America's most devastating war. The soldiers who enlisted to fight for the Union and Confederate forces were not all tall, strong-willed, and bearded men with land and wives awaiting their return. Instead, over 400,000 boys under the age of 17 joined the Union forces. In comparison, the Confederacy had over 100,000 fighting men under the age of 15. None of these young soldiers were landowners, and it's safe to say, none of them owned slaves. Most of the kids simply joined the war to escape everyday farm life and the repetitive cycle that comes with such an existence. Many of the underage soldiers convinced the recruitment agencies that they were of the age to enter combat by bending the rules. As the rules of combat state, a man must be over 18 to enlist. A way in which the underage kids got around this was basic semantics. As no kind of driver's license or social security card existed during the era, they would simply lie, and if that didn't work, they would get their fathers to vouch for them. However, not all of the younger kids saw violent action. Instead, many signed up for roles such as drummers or doctor's assistants. Others had jobs that included carrying canteens and stretchers and relaying messages to commanders on the battlefield. While not all saw actual combat experience with rifles, some made it through to the front line and ultimately perished in the brutal war. When it came to the grown men who had experienced the hellish conditions on the front line, a call to action from both the Union and Confederate leaders brought forth soldiers from all professions across the nation. While half were farmers before enlistment, others represented a wide variety of expertise and occupations, ranging from unskilled laborers to engineers, mechanics, college professors, and even hairdressers signed up to join the war. Many of the soldiers joined the cause for their own beliefs, and these greatly varied. While they believed they were doing the right thing, It's unlikely that the men were not prepared for the unforeseen circumstances that arose in such a brutal war. The daily life of a soldier during the Civil War was arduous, and for the millions of young Americans who left to fight, it would be an experience they would never forget. For many, it meant leaving behind loved ones for many months at a time. Their days were filled with long hours of training and drill, an inadequate amount of food, poor shelter, and long hikes through dusty trails or rainstorms. The diaries of Robert Watson make reference to the tedious amount of drilling the soldiers would be taken through. He wrote, "Drilled in the afternoon, inspection of arms, commenced drilling, drill as usual, morning and afternoon. Drilled and inspected our arms, quarters, and etc." Another source comes from Theodore Garish, who wrote of his experience as a soldier. "It was a most ludicrous march. We had never been drilled. An untrained drum corps furnished us with music. Each musician kept a different time, and each man in the regiment took a different step. We marched, ran, walked, galloped, and stood still in our vain endeavors to keep step." All of this practice and repetition helped soldiers to survive on the battlefield when those critical moments arrived. For the civilians turned soldiers, being in the military likely wasn't everything they had imagined, and certainly didn't compare to the life of those they had seen in hometown militias. Long periods of boredom ensued, interspersed with moments of sheer terror when the fighting began. Even discipline was a difficult concept to understand for the simple men who had been farmers or store clerks in the months prior. Soldiers from both the Union and Confederate armies were supposed to be well taken care of during deployment. Regarding infantry, they were entitled to the basics, including pork, beef, bread, potatoes, peas, honey, sugar, and coffee. Unfortunately, this wasn't the case, as both sides struggled to provide their soldiers with the bare minimum. In reality, many of the soldiers in the South lived off cornbread, coffee, or chicory if they could not get coffee, and cigarettes if and when they could get their hands on tobacco. Soldiers would end up supplementing what rations they did receive by foraging the lands around the camp, and some were lucky enough to receive boxes from their families, who awaited them at home. While the food may have been insufficient, it was still better than the conditions on the battlefield. For those who got injured or wounded, it was often certain death. If struck by a bullet on the battlefield, the soldiers would simply lie on the grass, hoping that the ambulance wagon would tend to their wounds. But if the bullets didn't get you, it's highly likely that disease was just around the corner. You may think that getting shot at a distance from a musket would have been a horrible death, and it certainly would have been. But there's a chance you may have lived. However, you were as good as dead if you got sick or caught an infection during this great war. More men lost their lives in the Civil War due to diseases such as diarrhea and dysentery. It's estimated that nearly 45,000 soldiers from the Union forces alone died from these diseases. In his book, Army Life, A Private's Reminiscences of the Civil War, Theodore Garish recalls a time spent too long in camp and writes, "One of the most disastrous features of the gloomy situation was the terrible sickness of the soldiers. Men were unused to the climate, the exposure, and the food, so that the whole experience was in direct contrast to their life at home. Common viruses and infections included typhoid fever, malaria, pneumonia, tuberculosis, pox, both small and chicken, scarlet fever, measles, mumps, and whooping cough. Infections spread like wildfire throughout the military camps, as doctors didn't sterilize any medical equipment. According to the best estimates, hospital workers amputated the limbs of nearly 70,000 men during the Civil War, with 1 in 4 dying from infection. As the war continued, months turned to years, and those who had enlisted during 1861 felt like they had served an eternity in the trenches and fields of the United States. Yet, the fighting men on both sides continued as best they could each day. The common soldiers of the Civil War were not without fear, pain, panic, or indecision, and shared the typical weaknesses of the human mentality. They were simply people, like you and me, and the terrible suffering that they experienced during the bloodiest war in the history of the United States is unimaginable to those who now live in the era for which they paid their sacrifice. Let us know what you thought about today's video. What do you think life would have been like for the average Civil War soldier? Leave us all your thoughts in the comments section below. For more videos on the most amazing forgotten parts of our history, be sure to subscribe to the Intrigued Mind channel. Like the video and leave your suggestions in the comments below.